I think that the thing that is intellectually dishonest about that, if you're kind of like pro tech generally, but then like you don't like crypto, is you just don't have a sector that has the ability to kind of like create its own money and then derivatives and all these other kind of remixable financial components and move at the speed of the internet. And I also just think it's like crypto speed running. It's the actual last recent invention that's like a fundamentally new thing that hasn't had that much time to like bake.
It's funny. Antonio was at this crypto dinner, and a few people were trying to shame him to leave so he can join us. And I was telling him, "Oh, we're doing Moment of Zen. Tell him to come join us." But I think we got a good agenda. So let's shall we get to it? Maybe let's start with congratulations. You guys just had a big announcement, big launch. Let's talk about it.
It's kind of interesting. So maybe this is a little inside baseball, but basically I just like tweet anything as an announcement because creating marketing and like it works. But I think it's significant in the sense that Farcaster to date has been in a beta, and so now we're kind of moving to the big leagues in the sense that it'll be live and soon to be 100% permissionless. And I think that's important because we're not just building a social network, we're trying to build a protocol. And I think the core part of the protocol is the underlying data and APIs are completely permissionless. You can sign up and use it without having to talk to anyone. I think that was the original goal, and that's where we're headed. And I think optimism will be an important part of like making that work for Farcaster. And for those on the show who don't know what optimism is, so to date, Ethereum, which is kind of the second biggest cryptocurrency after Bitcoin in terms of people building interesting new things, basically is Ethereum, and then everything else that is trying to be Ethereum or a slight variation of Ethereum. I think it's like Ethereum's game to lose. And so you've had Ethereum kind of really on the scene since 2016, 2017. And the biggest critiques of Ethereum were, one, it's too expensive, right? Like basically with a blockchain like Ethereum, like if everyone's trying to get access to the quote block space, the prices go up in terms of it's an auction every single 15 seconds. And so that's been a big issue. And anytime the market is really hot and there's some trendy new thing, Bored Apes, whatever, the block space in Ethereum gets really expensive. We call it gas. And people complain that it's way too expensive to use this and it's never going to work. And you feed the fuel of all these kind of like midwits on Twitter who are the like self-proclaimed Web3 critics. Like they haven't built anything of substance themselves. Maybe a couple of them have had some exits, although I know there's like one guy who he's really secure in his multiple exits that he lists the value of the exits that he's had. Sure sign that you're very confident in your own ability. Then let everyone know that you have these massive exits. Just like take the win and like. Anyways, getting away from the midwits, the expensive aspect of the blockchains is a valid and big critique as to why it will never be useful. And there's always kind of been this promise that Ethereum is going to scale in the future. And that has always felt like it's 2 years away. But where we are now, of course, during the bear market is last fall, Ethereum did this big thing called the merge, which also took another whole kind of vertical of critique and threw it out the window, is that cryptocurrency energy usage is causing climate change. But put aside all the other type of energy usage that also contributes to climate change, but specifically cryptocurrency was bad. And that is the case when you're mining, is that you are just kind of doing computing, generating heat, using electricity for the sake of securing the network, like what happens with Bitcoin. But Ethereum switched over to this thing called proof of stake, so a fancy way of saying you let the people who are the shareholders of the network do the security for the network. So it's a massive 99% decrease in electricity usage for Ethereum. So the climate change argument, check that off. And then the thing that's kind of enabled is a new set of changes that the network is planning to go do that enable these they call L2s. So if Ethereum is level 1, Optimism, there are other ones, Arbitrum, Polygon. There are some other ones that are kind of more fancy zero knowledge L2s, but collectively there's a group of kind of other blockchains that are helping scale the activity on Ethereum while still relying on kind of Ethereum as the core source of truth for the security of the underlying money and stuff like that. So anyways, we originally were planning to do Ethereum L1 for Farcaster, and I think over the last 6 months, the L2 ecosystem has developed enough that it's still kind of early. If we were doing something where we were moving a lot of money around at a protocol level, I still think we might not quite want to be jumping on L2s quite yet. But in the case of Farcaster, the stakes are somewhat low, especially given the size of the network today. And so taking a bet on kind of where the puck is going was what we decided to do, because it's a massive decrease in cost, right? So one of the things about Farcaster is we don't do much on chain. The one thing we do on chain is when you sign up. And if we were to do that on L1 Ethereum, like regular Ethereum, the average cost of a sign up in just purely paying to access and use the network and gas would have ranged from $10 today, when things aren't that crazy, to in a boom period $100. So this is not scalable for a social network. And with Optimism and then the general class of L2s, you're in order of magnitude, if not more, or reduction of costs. So no, yeah, it's a pretty significant cost savings. It's less than $1. It's 10 cents or something. So that is actually pretty significant, and that the usability of the system and how we kind of build the app for Farcaster to kind of abstract some of the complexity. That's always been a dream. Even when I joined Coinbase in 2014, a lot of it was like, okay, how can we abstract away some of the complexity of Bitcoin and then later cryptocurrency more broadly? Seed phrases, all this kind of stuff that's pretty nerdy and technical. And how do we get to kind of like something that feels more like Instagram? And I think that finally the technology underneath, this is kind of a long-winded way of saying that the infrastructure is finally there, where now it's not quite in the way anymore, and you can actually start to build pretty great apps. That actually brings us to the topic du jour. I know you mentioned in the chat before is Friend.tech, which is a new app in the kind of crypto ecosystem, built by a deeply crypto native team. It's actually really kind of emblematic of crypto. It's an entirely a non-team, at least from a public presence. So the founder is Racer. They used to have 0x Racer. They used to have an account, got locked. Really, really funny, like witty account, just banger after banger all the time. And then a couple other people like Shrimp Pepe. Like, I mean, like the names are pretty great. And they had worked on a project, I want to say it's 2 years ago now, called TweetDAO, which is kind of an interesting idea, where they took one Twitter account and then they tried to give access on chain to a whole bunch of people, and you could like vote on who could tweet from the account. So it's almost like a group alt or something for Twitter.
Yeah.
And then the next experiment that they did was something a little bit more Snapchat on chain. It's called SteelCam, where it's like you would encrypt a photo, and it's like if you owned it, you could decrypt it and like pass it along. And so that was kind of like a mix of Snapchat and the game. And then Friend.tech, the most recent project, which has done phenomenally well in terms of user adoption in a very short period of time, is relatively basic premise. So think like a group chat where your fans have to own a share. They've renamed them to keys. Probably some lawyer told them to do that, but basically it's like you get access to a group chat, and there are like some elements of like kind of like OnlyFans from that. There's obviously Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, has subscribers. There's Patreon. There's obviously Substack, and then so some of that kind of element of like I buy into a person, now have access to them. And what I think that they've done really well are two things. So the first is um, the kind of dual-edged sword of crypto is if you financialize something, it will grow really fast, and then if you financialize something, you're going to get a lot of kind of, I wouldn't call it like bad elements, but you're going to bring out some of the worst things in people. And so I think that they're kind of going through that, where they've had a massive amount of growth, because when you buy into these accounts, the share price or the key price of each person rises, and that you could trade it, you could sell it. And then the other brilliant thing that they've done in that regard is, just for signing up, if people start trading your shares, every time they trade the share, 10% of the trade goes to the kind of like Friend.tech, the app or the network. 5% goes, so half of that goes to the company, and then half of that goes to the person being traded. So I'll give you an example. I signed up just checking the app out. I bought one or two shares of people I know, like just $20 in, and just trying to kind of play around with it. And I think I haven't sold anything, but just by virtue of me being on the app, and I have not a huge following on Twitter, but enough. And I think I'm somewhere, it's like $1,000 worth of trading fees of just like the DWR Friend.tech account that people are trading back and forth. I'm getting the residual stuff out. I think Nikita Beer signed up, and I think he claimed he made like 10 grand in 12 hours. And there have been a couple of other kind of accounts that are well over $100,000. These aren't people doing anything. It's just when you're trading, you're getting some of that cut. And so I think that that's a brilliant mechanic for this team, for like naturally incentivizing people to check it out, right? Like, so you could imagine there's going to be a whole bunch of people on Instagram over the next few weeks who have big accounts and be like, wait a second, if I get on Friend.tech and people trade my account, I don't even have to do anything. I'm going to make money. I'm probably going to donate mine. I kind of want to make sure I'm like, no one's like, oh, you profited off my thing. It's like, I legitimately was just trying the app. I didn't even know that was part of the sign up. But the thing that they've also done really well, I was talking a little bit about this on Farcaster today, is they used kind of like a lesser known, but it's been around for a while, but there's been a material change, which I'll get to in a second, something called a progressive web app, so PWA. And there's been a lot of talk over the last few years about Apple's App Store tax, right? Like most famous case,
30%.
Tim Sweeney and Epic, and they basically were saying, hey, like Fortnite's paying 30% of stuff to Apple. Like, we don't want that deal. Like, we want a better deal. And we're Fortnite, we're the most popular game. Like, we're gonna fight you. And they actually lost in federal court to Apple. And basically the judge was like, Apple built the platform. Don't if people love Fortnite so much, they'll go buy an Android or do something different. And so we could talk about that, because there's like this whole antitrust movement against big tech for being big. In each case, whether it's Apple or Amazon, they all have kind of slightly different arguments. But the hard thing is that most antitrust stuff is consumer harm, and it's very hard to demonstrate consumer harm. It's like the consumer pays the price, and they get the nice in-app purchase experience, and the person who has to pay the tax is Epic. And now they would argue like, hey, I'm paying, I would have cheaper prices if I didn't have to pay the tax. But let's actually not get down to an antitrust argument. I want to go back to what the progressive web app that Friend.tech did is basically, rather than doing an app in the App Store, something you download, they just have a website, Friend.tech. And you go to it on your phone, and the first thing it says is you have to install this on your home screen, which is this like weird kind of like bookmark. No one really does that. But so you go to the share button and you tap add to home screen. It puts the bookmark with like an icon, so it looks just like a normal app. The app's logo is like light blue with like bunny ears. And what is interesting is Apple released, and I think this is probably because there's a lot of pressure. Apple, from an antitrust standpoint, there's this your EU Digital Markets Act that comes into play in 2024 next year. South Korea has already passed a law. Japan is passing a law around like alternative app stores. So they're getting a lot of pressure from developed countries all around the world to be like, you have to be a little bit more permissive. And so I think this is a little bit of a kind of fig leaf argument for Apple to say, hey, look, if you don't want to follow our App Store rules, just go and do a progressive web app. And so basically, it's just kind of taking a website that you could get to in Safari, but making it feel a little bit more like an app. But the other big thing is that now you get native push notifications, which is a critical part of like any app trying to, especially a social app, trying to build habit and get you to come back into the app. So these guys, it only like finally kind of rolled out in like May, June. So they're one of the first apps to get through the gate. And this is important for crypto because Apple deems any like kind of version of crypto outside of like investment in Bitcoin and ETH. It's a little weird. Like Coinbase can have an app and doesn't have to pay the tax, but like NFT apps. So if you go to like OpenSea's app, right? They have an app. Like the whole point on OpenSea is you buy and sell NFTs. You can't buy and sell NFTs on OpenSea's app. It's just like a pretty way of viewing it. And so this allows them to get outside of that and with this progressive web app. And so Friend.tech has been able to kind of create this like trading interface. And so I think it has like a bunch of talking heads on Twitter talking about how this could revolutionize things. I think I tweeted this, and I was talking about progressive web apps in February, like saying like, hey, I think this is interesting. Like I spent a lot of time thinking about like how to build the Farcaster apps and like understanding the App Store rules and where things are headed is like part of the job. But I think it's like okay, so my tweet was basically expired, like this like term like expired, tired, wired. Like it's like old school when Wired was a magazine. So expired is like a lot of crypto apps are like, oh, I'm not going to build a mobile app because of the App Store rules. And then tired is people thinking like PWAs are like the future of apps.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
Are you building a business? Well, if you haven't already been asked by potential customers or investors about things like SOC 2, ISO 27001, GDPR, or HIPAA compliance, well, guess what? You will be. Achieving compliance can actually unlock major growth for your company and build a foundation of trust. And Vanta can help. Vanta automates up to 90% of compliance work, getting you audit ready in weeks instead of months, and saving you up to 85% of associated costs. Vanta scales with your business, helping you successfully enter new markets, land bigger deals, and earn customer loyalty. And bonus, our Moment of Zen listeners get $1,000 off Vanta. Just go to vanta.com/zen. That's VANTA.com/ZEN.
If you're a startup founder or executive running a growing business, you know that as you scale, your systems break down and the cracks start to show. If this resonates with you, there are 3 numbers you need to know: 36,000, 25, and 1. 36,000. That's the number of businesses which have upgraded to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, streamline accounting, financial management, inventory, HR, and more. 25. NetSuite turns 25 this year. That's 25 years of helping businesses do more with less, close their books in days, not weeks, and drive down costs. 1, because your business is one of a kind, so you get a customized solution for all your KPIs in one efficient system with one source of truth. Manage risk, get reliable forecasts, and improve margins. Everything you need all in one place. Right now, download NetSuite's popular KPI checklist, designed to give you consistently excellent performance, absolutely free, at netsuite.com/zen. That's netsuite.com/zen to get your own KPI checklist. netsuite.com/zen.
And then the real wired move is, that like major economies around the world and maybe the US in the next 18 months very well could just force Apple's hand and we could get into an environment where you can just release a normal app and trade NFTs and not have to deal with all this rigmarole. But I think that there's like a version of, look, this is an app that has had tremendous growth in the crypto market in like deep crypto winter. Like right now, there's nothing going on in crypto. And I wouldn't say nothing in the sense that like you do have a lot of innovation that's like being built right now. And to give credit, the other thing that Friend.tech took advantage of was Coinbase released a new L2. This is going to sound a little confusing. Coinbase released a new L2 called Base that is an optimism, so the thing that Farcaster is joining, chain. So it's actually part of this thing that they're calling, it's like the super chain. It's like, I don't know, the Avengers of L2s, where Optimism is saying you can either join the like main Optimism chain, they call that OP Mania, that's where Farcaster is going, or if you need your own chain, we can provide that to you too. So you have like a company like Zora, which is like a NFT company, they have Zora chain, and then Coinbase. One of my former colleagues, Jesse Pollock, who I worked really closely with when I was at Coinbase, he's still at the company, and he's kind of had a second act in getting Coinbase to like figure out like how to be more crypto native. So kind of like within the industry, Coinbase a lot of times gets like, it's like, oh, they're IBM, like, or AOL. Like, it's like they were good for the early era. They were good for the kind of like fiat to crypto bridge. That's still a relevant business, but all the cool stuff is happening like on chain and decentralized and all that kind of stuff. And so Jesse kind of has like willed this thing into existence where now Coinbase actually has its own blockchain. And this is not crazy for centralized exchanges. Like Binance has had I think Binance has had like multiple attempts at chains, the most recent one being like Binance Smart Chain. But the interesting thing there is like you can imagine that Coinbase's chain is interesting for people because Coinbase has 100 million KYC accounts. And there, a lot of the UX of crypto is like, how do you get from I don't have any crypto to be able to use the crypto app? And if you take the 100 million people who already have a Coinbase account, they already have some kind of like fiat bank method, bank payment method or card payment method linked to their Coinbase account. They're only a few taps away from being able to use something on Base. And so Friend.tech was actually one of the first apps, like Base only launched a couple of weeks ago, one of the first apps out the gate on Base. And so it's just like kind of exciting because there's actually stuff happening now. But I do think we're still very much in the bear market. And I don't know, like I was at like last episode or whatever, Antonio was asking me about stuff and I gave him some like grim answer around crypto. And yeah, I think the challenge with a crypto winter is a lot of hopium tends to be tied to like Bitcoin monetary policy, which for those who kind of like don't follow this, like whenever Bitcoin every few years, the block reward, which is kind of like the inflation rate in Bitcoin, even though like Bitcoin long term is deflationary, there's an amount of new Bitcoin coming every 10 minutes, right? Every block, that's what's going on. That halves, just like in like clockwork. And whenever that happens, it kind of creates this mimetic reflexive thing where people are like, oh, wait, there's going to be less inflation in Bitcoin. And then so you usually get some kind of run up, and it's happened multiple times. And so at this point, it's basically religion that a Bitcoin halving is the way to get out of the bear market. Put a big asterisk next to that. That was a ZERP version of Bitcoin halving. So I think people there's a little bit of hopium that just like Bitcoin will kind of save the space in terms of a monetary policy push, when the reality is if the interest rates and kind of like risk premiums for assets is where it is today, no one in crypto has existed in that environment, at least at any amount of scale, right? Like crypto really comes onto the scene in 2012, 2013.
Yeah.
And it was still pretty fringe. It was like 2017 when it went more mainstream. And so the fact that all of these boom bust cycles have happened in a world where capital was really cheap and risk was valued, I think anyone telling you like when the bear market is ending, like they have no idea.
But even one critique of even the last bull market was that people had was that, hey, yeah, prices might be ripping, but where are the actual use cases in terms of how is this affecting people's lives in daily, besides some of the, like DeFi stuff, I guess. Or I'm curious, I guess, are you sympathetic to that critique? And whenever the markets rip again and there's another bull market, like for people who've tuned out of crypto or haven't even got into it yet, and they're all excited about AI or other things, like in the next few years, what are you expecting the main sort of either use cases that bring a billion users into crypto, or how are you thinking about that?
So I'm sympathetic to the idea that like what makes Silicon Valley great is Silicon Valley is good at building products that people use, right? Like that's where all the successes come from. These like massive consumer surpluses from the big companies. I think Google probably being the best in the sense that the average user doesn't ever pay Google anything. And look at all the value you get from Google. I think that the thing that is intellectually dishonest about that, if you're kind of like pro tech generally, but then like you don't like crypto, is you just don't have a sector that has the ability to kind of like create its own money and then derivatives and all these other kind of remixable financial components and move at the speed of the internet. And so if you just kind of like look at AI and everything that's happened, like everyone's criticizing crypto bull market, and then just kind of look at where the AI market, I mean, even the beginning of MOZ, like think about how many episodes right at the beginning, it's just like so frothy. And like you can start to feel that air coming out of the balloon, like some of that hype has not played out. And if you told me that there was like a way for retail to get in on the action of AI in like a meaningful way at the early stage, there would be so much BS like that people would be pointing at. It's like that AI use case doesn't even make sense and all of this. And so I think part of it is the direct access to global retail liquidity flows plus leverage plus like that's what makes crypto the worst in that regard. But I don't think like the companies who are kind of like raising these crazy AI valuations, and then you actually talk to any of these VCs privately, they're like, yeah, I have no idea where the value accrual is. And a lot of them they would say that it's probably growth stage companies, like optimistically, and more bearishly, it's probably just the big tech companies, which the capital markets have already rewarded, right? And so I think that is one element, and I also just think it's like crypto speed running. It's the actual last recent invention that's like a fundamentally new thing that hasn't had that much time to like bake. Whereas Mark always talks about how there was an AI boom in the 70s and the 80s and 90s, and like each decade they just rename it, and then maybe the size of the capital bubble is not as big, but part of that is because you're limiting it to institutional investors. And so I think I'm sympathetic in some ways that it's like you should have people who are capable of like understanding some amount of risk and realizing they can lose it all. And like the scammy retail stuff, I think is definitely worse in crypto than most places. But I don't know. I mean, look at Chamath SPACs, right? And I don't think you get to say just because the SEC approved SPACs that went down 90%, like you respond to someone on Twitter, I'm in the arena, you're on the sidelines, like you get a life, you're a loser. It's like I would have I'm sympathetic to the in the arena argument. And did he do anything illegal? Probably not. Like SPACs are legal. It's like a legal structure. There's a reason that they hadn't really been used, and that like tend to be like kind of scammy or really speculative, like gold mines and resource things. But the fact that he hasn't taken like a public L,
yeah,
right? So someone who like really prides himself, at least publicly, like the way he kind of presents himself all in is like, oh, I'm gonna steel man this, or don't win fuck American. And then it's like, okay, dude, you have a tweet where you compared yourself to Buffett with Geico with Metro Mile. It's down 94%. Just take the L. Like that's what people are going back to the authenticity thing of like politicians. That's what people crave. And I actually think Elon, he's not always like this, but I do think that there is a level of every so often he'll do something where he'll admit being wrong, and you talk to anyone at kind of like SpaceX or people who worked with him for a long time, and like whether he does it in like a real public way, there is a like he does have a truth seeking component to it where he will kind of correct when he's wrong. But I actually think that's a big critique also of like any public figure. It's like when you're wrong about something, just admit it, and then people kind of go, oh, like this is actually a more reasonable person, and then they lose that fuel. But it's like the doubling down, like the comparing yourself to Berkshire Hathaway in your investor letter, like, and kind of setting it up like we're going to do this every year because I'm so great, and the next year you just like kind of memory hole the whole thing.
Yeah,
that's BS. Like you should just take public accountability for the loss, and then you can say, hey, look, I tried something. Adults buying it, great. But so like going all the way back to the crypto stuff, I think if you just look around anywhere, there are grifts and kind of scammy stuff. I think crypto makes it easier to do a a lot less accountability. But that said, like, I don't know, they got Do Kwon, they have SPF, he's back in jail. Like, it feels like if anyone's gotten accountability, it's the crypto people. And there are a lot of people walking around. I mean, who went to jail for 2008? Like, I had to pay my tax dollars when I had to pay for it, but I didn't get anyone put in jail.
The fascinating thing about the accountability is there's also this other school of thought which says if you apologize, that means they'll just like destroy you.
I don't think it's apologizing. I think it's just like acknowledging, and it's kind of like weasel words, like in that tweet where it was like, I tried some things, like I'm in the arena, like F you.
Yeah.
Where, I don't know, maybe don't have these navel gazing public letters, like you know, one year you're comparing, you're like beating Buffett, and then the next year you memory hold that, and then, you know, and you're just getting ripped apart on Twitter, right? Like, especially FinTwit, like this is like all in on account. They're gonna read your letter, they're gonna like kind of figure out, so you probably got margin called and all this other kind of stuff. Um, I don't know. I just I would hope people hold me accountable. Like, I think one of the nice things about Farcaster is you kind of have to have a little bit of a humble pie in the sense of when you're wrong. And we can have a strong point of view of like, this is how we should build it, and these are the decisions we're making. But if I was to do something really stupid in terms of like hypocritical or trying to like, I don't know, whitewash is probably the wrong word, but it's I don't know, I'd get called out pretty fast, and I would just, I don't know, I'd hope I would take the L and not apologize, but just like kind of being like, yeah, I was wrong. Period. Like that's not an apology. It's an acknowledgement that you were wrong, and I think that's what people are looking for.
Yeah, it's not this necessarily groveling, like begging to get sort of their approval, but it's just like an admission. Yeah,
It's owning it. It's just like people want people to own stuff, because the thing is if you ride high on the pump, like in the pitch, when it doesn't play out, like, you better damn own that.
Totally. So let's get back to the other part of the question, which was in the next bull run, like what are the applications or use cases or like how is crypto going to get to 1 billion users?
I don't know if it's the next bull run, right? And I don't even like that term. It's like bull market is like a little bit better, upcycle, because it is very cyclical. I think just generally where I think crypto is going to do well is if the infrastructure around scaling continues to improve, then I think you're going to start to attract developers who now look at the technology and go, oh, I actually have this problem I'm trying to solve. And for the first time, the technology is like, you know, one of these, so kind of like what Coinbase has, the kind of like OP, the optimism chain. Some people are calling these app chains, right? So you have like Ethereum, and then you could just like go boot up one of these OP chains, which is basically the same kind of like programming environment for smart contracts as Ethereum. And I don't know, you could have a competitor to Visa, right? And maybe not at the speed and transaction processing of Visa, but the idea that you could have multiple financial institutions all using the same specific blockchain to trade things back and forth. And maybe that one's more KYC or something. And so I think you're just going to start to have smart people play around with what that enables. And I'm optimistic that, there you go, that you're going to start to see new types of crypto apps that have just improved user experience. They're able to abstract away a lot of the like kind of early on for the first 10 years of crypto complexity. And we're already starting to kind of see that, like the stuff that we're working on. I can like kind of see 12 months from now, when you sign up for Farcaster, you might not even know it's not crypto. It'll feel much closer to a Web2 app. And I think that, coupled with the actual underlying infrastructure, some people are going to figure out interesting stuff to do with that. And I think that it's only going to get better, because I think that there's a lot of interesting research that's still fundamentally happening in things like zero knowledge proofs, which we've talked about on the show before. But just like crypto is going to continue to nerd snipe really smart people, because there's a lot of like academic research that now has like a practical application within the kind of like hardcore cryptographic primitives. And as a result of that, the technology will get better. And as the technology gets better, entrepreneurs who don't necessarily need to do the R&D can just commercialize it and use it to solve problems. So when I go to the like billion users, it's like people just like kind of saying that, and not criticism as much as I see it a lot on Twitter. And I actually think that gives fuel for the midwits who then just like to argue. And it's just like, I don't know, like just focus on the people who are excited about building with it. And I suspect that a lot of those people will tend to be people who move to San Francisco. And like by being in San Francisco and meeting, other smart people who are working on different things, that cross-pollination of ideas. And then not to say that, crypto is actually more global of a like tech sector than I think a lot, but I do think that there is a advantage to being in San Francisco. Like, whereas now you're talking to the smartest AI people in the world. There's startup founders working on that stuff. And maybe there's something that clicks for you that you use crypto to do that, or vice versa.
Yeah. And one of your points in the last episode was that what you realized with Farcaster is this idea that like you had to be working on things that were uniquely enabled by crypto. Do you think is that your sort of belief for the space more broadly, that the things that emerge that will work are things that could only be built using crypto?
Yeah, I have a blog post on this that's significantly worse or non-existent. I actually don't think it was, I didn't coin that, just kind of had existed. I think Fred Ursum actually, picked it up somewhere and would say it at Coinbase. And I think it's actually the best way to think about crypto. And I think Peter Thiel has a version of this where it's like 10% versus 10x. But the basic idea is that if a crypto idea is trying to marginally improve something that already exists, at least today, it's still the kind of like UX complexity and the additional clunkiness of having to deal with this system is not going to outcompete a centralized system that's running on AWS and like just the pinnacle of where we are today. That the only good use cases for crypto are going to be in situations where there's literally nothing else that can do this, or significantly worse, right? And so obviously the natural example with Bitcoin early on was darknet markets. Bitcoin was the way to be able to send internet payments because you weren't going to be able to use PayPal or you would easily get shut down. And then naturally internet money generally, but there's a bit of like a circular thing with it. And that drives, I think, a lot of people crazy. And it's like, okay, this is actually not impacting the real world. It's not touching a mortgage. Like you're basically just speculating on other crypto, and all of the DeFi stuff is kind of like completely circular. But to use the Farcaster example, we want a kind of like name registry. So you can just kind of think about it as like every name on Twitter maps to some Ethereum address. Like that's essentially what we're building with Farcaster on chain. That's like the only thing we're doing on chain. No different than every name on Twitter on actual Twitter maps to an email address or a phone number, right? Like that's how you authenticate that you are who you are. The difference between the Farcaster version of that and Twitter, let's say you have the username X. You've been using it for 15 years on Twitter. You're happy. New owner comes in, decides that the new name of the app is X, offers you a t-shirt, and then takes away your name. In the end of the world, that's probably not the worst thing. You probably the Streisand effect, like you get a lot more recognition and whatever. But the reality is, no one has any expectation that they like really own their name. I think people maybe, but like the reality is you're just renting it. You're not even renting. You're not even paying Twitter. Twitter's letting you use it. And in a decentralized version of the world, assuming you can get people to use it, like that's its own thing. You actually own like your account and your name. No one can take it away from you. And that is, I'm not aware of any system you could build in a centralized way that ultimately either there's some central administrator who can change the value in that database, or they can just unplug the server if they try to make it not like that. Whereas the beauty of putting that on a blockchain is that every computer running Optimism, which there are many out there, is running a version of that registry. So you go pull one out of the wall, or no one can muck with that. And so I think that is an example, basic example of something that you can only do with a blockchain that you can't do with a centralized system. And I think what we will see over the next 5 or 10 years are more and more use cases, now that some of this infrastructure is getting better, where people can build systems that were just fundamentally not possible with centralized systems. Now, whether you think that's valuable, I don't know. Like, I think it's valuable. That's why I'm building one.
And if you had to outline in the most like crisp way why that's valuable, what would you say?
In the case of something like Twitter, and I hate to even just like make Farcaster Twitter, like just say just purely a public social network where people kind of have like a graph relationship. I follow you, you follow me, like we interact, all these kind of connections, right? The world where that works, like if you can somehow will that into existence, so that's very much what we're trying to figure out with Farcaster, that will attract an enormous amount of developer interest, because now people are very social. Like people are going to want to try to build new experiences to connect with each other. Look at how many different versions of dating apps there are. Like it's just like, people are constantly craving some new way to connect, right? Different social networks. If a developer who comes up with an interesting new way for people to kind of connect and socialize online can go build on this kind of open protocol, they are able to capture all of the value that they generate for the most part, in the sense that no one can come in and say, no, you can't use this anymore. If you were to try to do that on a centralized social network, which we have two prominent examples. Early days in Facebook, they had, Facebook Connect. Like you sign in with Facebook, it was like you could have apps. There was an actual app that you could like buy and trade your friends on Facebook, which I think forget the guy's name. He's like on Twitter, and he sold that to Zynga, which was obviously a company that was specifically built on top of like Facebook's platform. And then Facebook changed their strategy, and then that went away. So all of that, those developers who worked really hard to add value to Facebook, right, had the rug pulled out. Same thing with Twitter, right? All of the early Twitter apps, mobile apps, were all third party. Twitter acquired one of them, then started to put restrictions on the API. Kind of like ran along as like this wounded API for 10 years. Elon comes along and says, sorry, this is a cost center. We're just getting rid of it. So the fact that there was so much innovation that actually happened in those third-party clients, like they invented the retweet and the quote tweet, and hashtags were invented by users, that replies were invented by like all that innovation was not actually done by the core team. And so now we're in an environment where Twitter or X is run by a product dictator, which not the worst strategy in the world. Like great things tend to do get built by like very opinionated people. But I would argue that if you can actually have a protocol, then you're getting the collective group of product dictators, and that you have a whole bunch of different people building things independently, knowing that whatever they build, they actually have true ownership over. And we have an example of this. This has worked really well. It's called the web, right? It's like completely decentralized. And if I build a website, there is no Apple tax. There is no, like, I am the king of my kingdom on my website. And so I think getting a social network, which has a certain set of things, to the level of the web, what I think would be a massive net, increase in innovation and utility of the world. Utility is probably not the right word, because now I sound like EA. It's just like there's massive consumer surplus.
But yeah, existing social networks would never let that happen. So the idea would be that you just win over by creating a better product such that enough people switch over. Or if there's a new social network every 15 years or something, just kind of like the next generation might be sort of, crypto native.
Well, I don't even think, like, ignore the crypto part, right? Like if you're just strictly using the crypto underneath to solve the problem of like, how do you actually keep this in a way that stays credibly kind of neutral and decentralized, that's the crypto element for Farcaster. Everything else is just like, you don't need any of the other cryptocurrency. Like you just try to build a generalizable protocol that other people can build social networks on. I think that the challenging thing and the thing that we're still trying to figure out is how do you get the network effect flywheel going, right? So because it's like the early version felt very much like a Twitter clone. It's increasingly less like that. We made a lot of changes to the product. Some things have worked, some haven't. And I think the conventional strategy is no one knows how social networks work. Maybe Nikita Beer knows like how teenagers with anonymous polling apps, but like for the most part, you actually don't have a lot of people who are just like social network after social network, like it's just kind of catching lightning in the bottle. So the conventional approach is you just have 1,000 people independently try social networks and maybe one or two of them work, and you just never hear about the 998 that didn't, right? Or maybe hear a few that are like subscale. Our point of view, because we're trying to build the protocol, is we're just going to try to iteratively do it and like build this as a bit of like a movement and a kind of like people are excited about the fact that the protocol Farcaster isn't owned by anyone, right? Like our company Warpcast has an app, right? So you can think of that as like Gmail to email, or if you want to use a crypto example, MetaMask to Ethereum, right? So we have the app that is on the protocol. And our point of view is if we can get the protocol to be successful, our app will be valuable long term. But I think there is an ethos around the underlying Farcaster protocol that over the last 3 years that we've built, in that people feel ownership in this protocol, despite there's no equity ownership in Farcaster itself. So 2 examples. One, a bunch of like 100 people had like a Farcaster conference in June of this year in Boston called Farcon. Like we didn't organize it. Like it was just 100 people who had met on the internet and they thought like, this is really cool. Let's have a conference about Farcaster. It's like a 1-day thing. Went to it. Really cool to meet a bunch of people that I'd never met before. Another one is people on Farcaster have created like DAOs. Basically, it's just like kind of like an internet fan club or group. And in this case, people actually like put a little bit of money into a pot, and then they get to decide what they do with the money. Like, and then the goal of one of these purple is to like further grow Farcaster awareness. People are doing this like on their own. Like they're just like kind of excited about like where Farcaster is headed. And so both are really great. And then and that is actually what I think is different is if you're a centralized company, I don't think anyone's getting that excited about it. Like it's like, okay, fine. Like this is a product that's useful to me. But I don't feel any ownership in the brand. It's not like who I am. Whereas I think one of the elements that, Varun, my co-founder, and I both learned in the 10 years having worked in crypto, both at Coinbase and now Farcaster, is there's really strong affinity to some of these cryptocurrency blockchains, like Ethereum. People are like, there's almost like a religious component to it.
Yeah.
And I think that there are also some open source projects that exist out there that people are really passionate about. So like people are really passionate about Linux, or they're really passionate about Python or React, like in JavaScript world. And so the model actually is a little bit more like we're building an open source software like movement, but with maybe not just developers, right? Because people are actually participating in the social network. And so that's been a little bit more of our contrarian strategy is can you build a consumer grade social network and underneath like a developer grade protocol, much more akin to a traditional like slow build on an open source movement. So that's how we've approached it. Like our point of view is like we have no capabilities at like we're geniuses around growth and all this other kind of stuff. We're just trying to build it in a way that's authentic to us. And it's like, make sure the tech works, try to get good people to use it, listen to their feedback, and make progress week over week.
And so we talked about on this podcast with Eugene and others just how social media is bifurcating. And it's hard to imagine a new social network kind of that competes with Twitter, kind of taking over, all of Twitter. It feels like people are building their own fiefdoms, so to speak. And right now, to date, it seems like you've really captured a lot of the influential parts of crypto Twitter. And is your belief that the user base will 10,000x or 100,000x from here, or is it that you will figure out, like, are you going to make a little bit of money from hundreds of millions of people, or are you going to make a lot of money from a smaller subset of people, or do you dispute the premise of that question or the assumptions of that?
So one, I think we've done okay with crypto Twitter, like influential people. Like we have some big name folks who use it, but what I would say that Eugene is 100% spot on is status as a service. That sounds like a broken record on this stuff, but most of the people who have a lot of followers on Farcaster don't have a lot of followers on Twitter, and they're like Farcaster native, and I think that's great. I didn't know most of them before. If you take the 100 most active people on the network, and then kind of like weight them by followers or whatever, like that core group of people, a lot of them are kind of like new micro celebrities within the Farcaster ecosystem. And I think that's awesome. And so Eugene, spot on in terms of like that. This is how it is. I think I originally tried to do a little bit of like kind of extract my network from Twitter. That failed completely. I think my view is just like focus on the next milestone rather than, because if you just sit there and you think about like Facebook's got how many billion daily active users, like, and you've got single digit thousands, it would just be so crushing. You might as well not do it. Versus if I think about like a year ago where we were in hundreds of users per day, and then a year before that we were in the tens of users per day. And so again, like going back to that doesn't sound like this guy knows what he's talking about in terms of building a social network. I don't. Like, this is the first time I'm trying to do it. And so if I just look at the progress, like, okay, like, can we just string together 2, 3, 4, 5 more years of growth? Like, hopefully at some point you hit some inflection point and maybe grow faster. But I think what's underrated is the parable of the kind of like, would you rather have I'm trying to tell a parable, I don't even know, but it's the chessboard, right? It's like 1 grain of rice on each square of the chessboard. So it's squared to the 60. I think there's 64. So by the 64th, it's like you have more rice than exists in the universe. So I think like our point of view is week over week progress every week, see where you go. And so like I'm really focused on, it's like, how do I get to the next order of magnitude? How do I get to the tens of thousands of daily active users, right? Because every user that's using our app is a user for the protocol. And I think if you just kind of think in those orders of magnitude, you have to adjust your strategy of like, okay, well, how do I get to the next order of magnitude? Like, probably the path that got me here from the last one is not going to work, right? Like, manually onboarded the first couple hundred people via Zoom call. The next, couple order of magnitude, I just had people DM me on Twitter. Like, we're phasing out of that. So moving to a new strategy to continue to figure out how to grow things. Look, if the daily active users just like collapsed over a 3-month period and like everyone just stopped using it, I think we have to probably go back to the drawing board. But right now it's slow and steady grind up. So it's just like, okay, like make things a little bit better each week.
But is the no, that makes sense. But your user base, I sense, has high overlap in terms of the types of things that they like to sort of buy within crypto, in the sense that, like, you could imagine your goal is, hey, we're going to keep growing orders of magnitude and eventually try to be as big as Twitter. Your goal could also be, hey, we're going to try to get all crypto people who buy certain NFTs to join Farcaster, and then we're going to like sell them something else because they're so passionate about the platform, they're so passionate about the people, that the community on the platform, that we have brand affinity, and we could sort of sell high ticket items to a smaller being hundreds of thousands or low digit millions. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I would frame it as my expected value over the next few years, outside of barring some major breakthrough, is if we're successful in what we're doing, we will have single-digit million DAO in like our app Workcast. Like we'll have just figured out each step, like made that progress, and in a few years we're at that point. That's still subscale for social network, right? Like you look at like Twitter and some of the other ones. Snapchat, right? Snapchat, I think like Snap has like 700 million now, or like it's some crazy number, and they just like get hammered every one of their earnings because they just don't do as well at monetizing as Facebook. So I think one, ad-based revenue is like that is not like a hopium, which was the kind of like previous era of social, is just like get big as possible and make money on ads. And it's like that kind of doesn't work. So I think we have to figure out other ways to monetize. The one interesting thing about being in crypto, to your point, is there's actually just a lot of like economic activity that's happening. So there are natural ways to kind of like plug into that and add, value that enough that people would want to pay you a little fee or a cut of something. So that's like one whole area. And in a world where you're capturing a percentage of value moving through, you start to look more like something like Stripe, right? Not directly, but the idea is like you're thinking a little bit more as like on a layer of value in kind of economic transactions, rather than ads, which is like drive the number of eyeballs up and then just try to sell it against those eyeballs. I think that there's also a component, and I was actually talking about this with someone on Farcaster today, but one thing to think about is like subreddits. Big subreddits have over 1 million people in them. And maybe each subreddit should be its own social network. And I think we have some stuff that we're working on with Farcaster. We call them channels, but you can kind of think of them as decentralized subreddits. But I would imagine that if you took 10 at scale subreddits and you were able to build like a better product. I think there's even a company that's trying to build something for like Wall Street bets, right? Like they're trying to build like a verticalized like social network around like stock trading tips, that kind of stuff. So that's like an example of a venture-backed fund. But you can imagine that the verticals that people it works with, and you don't know which ones, beyond just crypto, those become their own kind of businesses, and you string together enough of them. And again, there's the protocol versus the actual like our app. But I don't know. I think like a 1 million person subreddit in a specific topic is probably like a $10 million EBITDA business. So is that venture scale? No. But if you had 10 or 15 or 20 of them, and then you were just like really good at those, and then you don't hire 7,000 people and have like HR departments and DEI departments and like all this other kind of like, and I shouldn't say you don't have an HR department, but like just basically all these like professional managerial class people who are just like there for meetings. And like you just like a really efficient organization, which obviously Elon has shown. You can take his decisions and antics on one side, but the reality is there were people in November who've never built anything of like substance from a technology standpoint. That Twitter is 2 weeks away from falling apart. Last time I checked, it works. Like
yeah.
So that bloat in the kind of like PMC version of Silicon Valley, like just don't make that mistake. And we were talking in the group chat about I don't know, there was some like kind of like mid-billionaire like increase in billionaire thing. And I think that there is an interesting point though, that there is a realization that venture scale companies they will continue to exist, and that's the thing that like makes Silicon Valley special. And like frankly, like why, if I was young in my career, I'd want to go move to San Francisco despite the dysfunction, is like the ability to attach yourself in an early age to your early part of your career to something that is a rocket ship. Like that is such a unique experience, both from a career experience standpoint, economic standpoint, future optionality in terms of like your trajectory.
Yeah.
That I think will exist. But I do agree with that take around like, I do think there's just going to be more 10-person, 20-person companies. Don't take venture capital in the traditional sense. Maybe you take some outside investment and you go back to a little bit more of like a dividend structure or something, rev share. I mean, you're a great example of this in the sense that like you're kind of like trained and brought up in Silicon Valley, but to pretend that's you own the business. We have friends who are kind of in that vein. And I think AI is only going to give that more leverage and stuff like that. And so, if I go back to the Farcaster world, if like we're successful in proliferating this protocol, I can imagine you have, 100,000 different independent little like kind of micro social networks that monetize in different ways. Like I think there's like a business surf line. And I don't even think it's really a social network. I don't use it on the surfer, but I think it's like they make a ton of money because there are a bunch of people who are passionate about surfing that want the surf camps. And I think there's another one like On the Snow, where they give like snow forecasts that are better than Google or weather.com. And that's like a $10 million a year business run by like a couple of people. And so I just think that to use like the Ben Thompson kind of like find your niche and like on the internet, the scale is big. I think that there's a world where if the underlying infrastructure is taken care of by a protocol, which that would be the case with Farcast, right? You don't need to go build the distribution of like, in terms of like the actual servers that generate the feeds and all this kind of stuff for Twitter. You just can like plug into this thing. There's already existing liquidity, and then you build the best experience on top of it, and you're able to figure out ways to monetize. That becomes a pretty viable business, and you don't need that many people on it.
Yeah, a few thoughts there. So yeah, the take was from Sam Lessin, basically saying, hey, there's going to be all these billionaires you never heard of because they're going to dominate some niche, and the internet, so many people are now on internet and mobile that these niches have gotten to a set of scale where you can now build massive businesses going deep on niches. And to your point, if I was to ask this audience, what's the most successful media company of the past 15, 20 years? Most people would not know this company called Industry Dive. Industry Dive is a B2B media company. It barely raised any money, small angel round. It sold for $500 million. And it's probably worth a lot more than that today. And it's basically just a series of niche publications. It's like HR Dive, CFO Dive, pharma dive, just these like unsexy positions or industries that are that have high budgets behind them, basically, or highly valuable audiences to own. And Industry Dive started, I believe, in the early 2010s and hasn't really iterated their product a ton. And so another company, Workweek, looked at them and said, hey, if they were started in 2023, they would look more like, Lenny Rachitsky and what he's done for product managers, or Harry Stebbings and for VCs, and kind of the rise of this business creator class. And I looked at what they were doing and said, yeah, that's pretty interesting. I'm starting in podcasts. They've gone super deep in newsletters. I really respect what they're doing. And so, yeah, that's why we're trying to create a bunch of like category defining show. We have a CFO show coming out pretty soon. So yeah, it's definitely the belief that there's there's riches in niches, and especially if you're the best one, and especially in B2B and enterprise.
Yeah, look, I buy that. I think the thing I was quibbling with Sam on is he said that AI is the last grasp of the old model. It's like, okay, that's it's like we have Apple Vision Pro coming out next year, dog. Like there's gonna be a whole new paradigm and a whole bunch of capital that needs to get deployed into that. So but I do agree with him in the sense that I do think you're just gonna have more people who can get a lot of leverage out of technology and just continue to churn away. Yeah, I think just from my own experience and kind of seeing maybe some more antiquated industries, people I'm close with, like how they're approaching with technology and the differential, like they're not even technologists, like they can't program, but like they can use Airtable,
yeah,
Shopify and some of these other tools, and seeing how much more like efficiency they get in their business as a result of that. Like there's just still so much untapped part of the economy that can benefit from that. And so I think you'll just see a lot of people just continue to churn away at it. The thing is that it probably is not going to be venture backable, and it's also not necessarily sexy. Like podcasting business is sexy because you're doing podcasting, which is cool. If you're doing some industrial supply marketplace that like, there are only 30 companies in the world that use it, but you now have a monopoly on that and you can make a lot of money on it. Great. So
no, I'll concede it. It's not sexy in the same way that building a venture backed thing that raises a lot of money is sexy. But I think there's a whole generation of founders, me included, who have raised lots of money, who realize that maybe that's like that works when things go really well, but most times things don't go really well, and there isn't as much optionality for all types of founders. And actually owning your own business can give you a lot more optionality. And if you don't need to fundraise, if you can self-fund and have the luxury to. And for the types of businesses that I started or was a part of, Product Hunt and On Deck, probably didn't need a ton of capital. I think we've, in the last few years, we as an industry have learned the hard way that venture isn't the appropriate funding mechanism for every single type of business. And in fact, it's maybe for only like certain types of businesses, are most appropriate for venture, ones that have a certain scale potential, and then, ones that have certain, high fixed costs or upfront costs in order to sort of realize that vision. But for content businesses, for community businesses, commerce businesses, it's getting easier and easier to get these off the ground, prove demand, and yeah.
Well, that's tying it all the way back. It's like, okay, so people love giving crypto crap about like creating money and financial stuff. But the big issue is the SEC's kind of like lack of clear guidance and the gray cloud that exists over crypto. And it's like, is this, fundraising security or whatever? But there is actually like a lot of really interesting stuff in crypto that should there be a little bit more guidance, and you can kind of know like, okay, this is regulated versus this is not, or how would you manage it? Like, just think about a lot of those businesses that you just brought up. It's like, maybe they should be a DAO, and like, or like, here's an example that's non-crypto, but like you could easily facilitate with crypto co-op. Like you go to like your crunchy grocery store, and you're like, oh wow, this is like so great that the workers own and participate. REI, big company, like it is a co-op. Like, so why can't we take that structure and stick it on the internet in an internet native way, where if I'm an early customer to an up and coming brand, why shouldn't I have some upside in it? And maybe you cap it in terms of like how much they're able to invest or whatever. And you can solve for this stuff if you actually want to take an approach to say, hey, we do want more financial innovation, because financial innovation, when it works, right? So financial innovation, when it's scammy, just creates like all these tiers, and then everyone gets really mad, and you have all this reactionary. But when it works, it like actually creates massive consumer surplus, right? Like stock corporations, like they're good. We've all benefited from, if you've ever had any amount of equity compensation, like the joint stock corporation invented in Holland in the 17th century. Good thing. Like, I'm glad we have it. But you also have the Mississippi Company in 18th century France that bankrupted the country and probably was like one of the underlying causes to the French Revolution. So like there's going to be some good and the bad with this stuff. Another basic example, and you can kind of go through the merits of this, but like mortgage-backed securities made the mortgage market that much more efficient, which decreased the kind of like, or lowered the barrier for people to get into the market. Maybe at a certain point it got too low, but generally, like, Americans have this incredibly powerful financial instrument that the government is involved in, but overall it's the markets that exist in that make it that much more accessible, right? And so I think like financial market innovation, it doesn't come from Wall Street, like for the most part. Like they are very slow at it, and they're increasingly regulated. And little banks really don't do much of that. And so actually getting to a world where you actually have more innovation around financial markets, I think is probably good. And yes, people will lose money, but in the long run, the market will probably find new and interesting ways to kind of do capital formation around people who need capital. Yeah. And I think, like, look, if you want to get like really historic, like, if you look at the history, it's like capital formation is the like critical input into the rise of both the British Empire and then later like the US. It's like capital markets are critical, in addition to like strong property rights in prosperity. So like we should be in the same way that we were looking for the cure for cancer, like new financial innovation is a good thing.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, crypto has both appealed to people on the right and people on the left for different reasons. And I feel like the financial innovation part, specifically the part that says, hey, when a company gets or product gets successful, it shouldn't just be the employees who reap the rewards in addition to the owners. Customers should also, your users should also get upside. Like, we should expand the pool of people who has upside. And it appeals to a certain left, a person on the left who wants more equality, wants more people to benefit from it, but also is like, rational enough to believe in markets and believe in capitalism, and sort of like aligns. They're sort of like both the side that cares about growth, and is smart enough to understand the importance of that, but also sort of the moral side of, hey, I also want people to be included in that growth. And that vision hasn't yet like come to pass in a massive way, but yeah, that's the opportunity, and it appeals to that kind of person.
Well, I mean, my friend Jesse Pollack, like, we probably don't agree on a lot on the like hardcore political side of things, but I think he approaches crypto from this is actually a powerful new thing that we can include a lot more people in the upside of things. And I think that's great. Like that to me is like showing it's a technology that is not so politicized. I think it's become a little bit more because of Elizabeth Warren. And even AOC, who we talk about on the show, like she doesn't have an explicit anti-crypto thing. I actually think, back to how savvy she is, I think she realizes that younger people look at this on her side of the political spectrum and say, hey, this is a way for increasing my participation in the upside. And so, I don't think she's had like an outright negative. I mean, some of the scam stuff, fine, but like as a technology category, I mean, Elizabeth Warren said she was raising an anti-crypto army.
Yeah,
like she is anti-innovation, and the irony is she's the one who created the CFPB, yet she's doing everything in her power, which probably means that there's, you create the CFPB as a way to make sure that the banks start donating to you or to your super PAC or people you're affiliated with. I actually don't know like what that is, but it strikes me as, I'm going to truth power to the banks, and then you're trying to ban crypto. But like Richie Torres in New York, so he's in one of the poorest districts, congressional districts in America. He's pro crypto. So I think it, over the kind of next 5 to 10 years, it probably becomes a bipartisan thing.
Yeah.
And we're hopefully in a better place where we actually permit people to start innovating a little bit more and impact real world use cases that like people can actually look at and hang around and say, this is actually pretty cool. Like, this isn't just circular people speculating crypto for the sake of crypto.
I've always thought, thought there was an opportunity for like some version of UBI, to the extent that it existed, to be tied to the S&P 500, so that like everyone is aligned. If you think of, we've had over the last decade this kind of like demonized billionaires rhetoric, because when Amazon does well, of course it impacts the whole economy, but most people don't see it in the same way as if they were just clearly getting richer. And so if UBI was tied to that, they would be getting richer and sort of all on the same side. But crypto does it in more native ways, in theory. And so that is.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that the easiest way to get more people to, I mean, the Democrats wouldn't do this because people wouldn't want to vote for them as much. Is everyone, when they're born, they get a, people have called it Invest in America, or just like your equivalent of 401k is stupid, right? Like, think about how dumb that is. Like, so if you're a government employee, you win a lottery, like you get like the best retirement for literally working in some, there are some people who are actually doing like jobs that are in harm's way and really serving us. But for the most part, if you work at the DMV, like why should you have like better retirement than someone who's doing backbreaking labor in the private sector? That's crazy. Okay, so we should not give municipal and federal employees better deals. Like, everyone should basically get the same, anything that they're giving the government employees, like that should be the standard American plan, which obviously you have to bring down because we can't afford to do all that, like overpromise. And as a result, Like you get rid of all the state ones, and it's like, great, here's the America pension. You get to see your whole life what you're contributing into it. And maybe there is some component where there's a basic one that gets added before you start working. And as you get to working age, you are contributing some of your Social Security dollars. And whether it technically is actually going in or it's the promise, which you can get into, it's actually not there because we're spending more than it's coming in. But you should be able to see that is growing in an account. You can't trade it. It's literally the S&P 500 or something that we all agree is like, this is the best representative index. Like there's basically no management fee on it. And as the US economy is growing, you feel like you're participating in it. And I think it would just take a lot of work to make that happen. And I think what would be challenging is you don't see any of the impact of that in a 4-year term. So maybe it's like a second. If somehow you got a president to get reelected with like a landslide and they decided that was their signature thing on their way out, that would be tremendous, because now all of a sudden every American would feel like as they contribute into the system and those entitlement dollars come back and they're reflected in an app that they could look at, and they know that, okay, if the country is doing better, I'm going to be able to have a good retirement. So I think that would be great, but wouldn't happen because that would also make people be like, wait, like what are we doing? Like what are our policies doing to grow the economy?
Yeah, it's fascinating. It is interesting to think about how when new technologies come out, sometimes they're hated by a group of people who's worried about their uses of it, but once they realize they can use that technology for their own ends, maybe they get more excited about it.
I have a spicy one that we could move into because we're going to talk about in the group chat.
Please.
So one topic that people don't really like talking about is genetics and IQ.
Yep.
And we were trading things back and forth. For those who haven't really got into this debate, there's a famous book in the 90s, The Bell Curve, by an academic named Charles Murray, and makes some claims in that book that different races have different propensity for IQ, and got canceled in the 90s for it, and kind of has been canceled since. And a couple of years ago, I think it was like 2018, Sam Harris, popular podcaster, brought Charles Murray back into the scene, and they did like a multi-hour interview and talked about the book and all this kind of stuff, and then just generally around like genetics and intelligence. The other thing I think that there was a catalyst for that is David Reich, who is, I think he's like a chair professor at Harvard in I want to say it's like genetic anthropology or it's something where or archaeology. I think he's studying genetics across time and geographies. And he has a really interesting book. Tyler Cowen, when I only discovered it, I'm not like really into this area. I was at Coinbase. We just come off the like big growth year and we had a little bit more breathing room. And I remember I was reading Marginal Revolution, and Tyler referred to this book as like one of the best books of the year, maybe one of the most important books of the decade, or all that. And so I was like, okay, I should buy this. It's a fascinating book, who we are and how we got here. I think like more people should go read this book. Some technical sections you can kind of like skip through it, but overall pretty cogent. And it kind of made me think like, oh, interesting. Like we have the story we tell ourselves around history in a bunch of different things. Like if you just talk about like humans moved out of Africa and then they moved to kind of like, the Fertile Crescent, and then from there, and like Neanderthals and all these other kind of like related Homo like species that didn't make it. And so this is a fascinating book from a genetic standpoint. But around the time of that book, he wrote a New York Times op-ed that was genetics and race, but he also specifically was talking about intelligence without mentioning, or maybe he did, but like really not talking about Charles Murray. And this is a guy who's at Harvard, right? So he's very much in the kind of cathedral, like knows how to play the game. He's not getting canceled. But he basically made a point where he said, hey, we don't want to talk about anything related to genetic heritability of intelligence, but we all talk about how you can inherit disease through your genetics. We talk about that you know, obviously basketball players that are tall, like we know that they're tall because of genetics. Like so there's like a whole bunch of stuff that we acknowledge that genetics work, and then there's this like part of our body, like the brain. It's like absolutely not. That has nothing to do with genetics. And his point is that it's kind of like this ostrich head in the sand because it's an uncomfortable topic and people have been canceled about it. We as a society are not going to deal with this. And his point in 2018 was there's a tidal wave coming. Like we're really starting to, 20 years into the having sequenced human genome, like we're really starting to understand and like be able to map things, and computers are getting better, sequencing is getting cheaper. And we should start having these discussions because what's going to happen, and we've seen a little bit of this in China because there's this technology with DNA called CRISPR, which is, you can kind of think of it as like gene editing and be able to take things out of your genome. And I think there's a pretty famous case where a doctor in China, supposedly rogue, what is it? I think it was like HIV or something, where they edited the genes of some twins or something to remove or some type of genetic condition. And then he was disbarred because, this is pre-COVID. It was like, oh no, like you're violating ethics. And the Chinese kind of said, we've disappeared this guy, which I don't know if he actually has been disappeared. Maybe he's working in the lab on making super babies in China. But the point is that not everyone is going to have the same set of ethics and morals, and frankly, like inability to discuss hard topics that we have here in the US and then in the West more generally. And so David Reich is basically saying, it's like, probably should just start actually trying to engage on this conversation rather than stick our head in the sand, because we are going to get to a place pretty soon where that new technology is going to flip, right? CRISPR and the ability to like map out. And if you've ever seen the movie Gattaca, which is a great movie, worth watching to kind of like prime your mind on this. But what happens when now all of a sudden the Chinese are like, we've developed a technology that allows you to dial up the intelligence of people. And so you're going to watch so fast, watch it, like in the next few years, it's going to go from intelligence is not related to genetics, and absolutely not, we're not going to talk about this, to we need equity for intelligence. And everyone who is genetically not as smart as other people, I would hope at least the argument would be we need to boost them. But I can imagine we're also going to, if you kind of think of the meme where people are get down, is we might have to make you a little dumber genetically, because that is not fair. And I know that sounds crazy, but like it is fascinating to me that we as a society are not even talking about this, yet that train, the genetic editing train, is barreling ahead. So I think it's a great example of where, like, I already know how that side of the kind of technology or science is going to flip. Believe science is going to go from it doesn't exist to we need to be using this remedially on everybody.
Well, history rhymes. I mean, wasn't eugenics like a progressive or left-wing project, like 100 years?
Remember that racism was originally a progressive organization, Planned Parenthood, right? Because it was, we need to actually make sure that less desirable mothers don't have kids.
Yeah.
And so if you actually type in like racism Planned Parenthood, it's in their about page, and they do like kind of almost like a land acknowledgement of, yes, we're doing good today, even though we were started as a eugenics organization. I think it's worth poking at people who are kind of like holier than that.
Right. And eugenics got a really bad name, obviously.
Basically, no one before 1930, like history is just like completely non-existent for most people. Is that like you start digging into the 20s and they're just like, whoa.
Yeah. And it got a really bad name, obviously, during or after World War II, in terms of what happened with Germany, such that people have been so scared since. But
Tyler Cohen would point out the kind of averages over is we're already doing this. It's implicit. It's just kind of the way we do it. Is you have no genetic mixing between certain socioeconomic classes. like a little bit. Some people make it out, but for the most part, it's like you're a coastal elite. Like you're only hanging out with other coastal elites. You're almost certainly getting married to another coastal elite, and like extrapolate that out over a few generations, and like you're
Charles Murray has a book called Coming Apart, which makes that exact case. It's a fascinating, book. Everyone's a eugenicist if they're deliberate about who they're marrying or having kids with. Or if they're trying to find.
By the way, there's like an argument that is, it's not a judgment as much as, and obviously to use the term, like people would freak out, but it's pretty cultural, right? There are a lot of cultures around the world. It's like, I don't want you marrying someone outside of our culture. Like it's like that is, and I think it is like, PMC coastal elites were like, oh, that's not PC, or, like I should be able to marry anyone I want. But like, if we actually want to talk about the like predominant way humans operate, both like globally today, as well as historically, not to say that it's right, but it's like, no, you marry someone from our culture. Like that's how the kind of like tribe has, proliferated and continued through history.
Yeah.
I mean, this is perfect fodder for Antonio. Like, I mean, he's at dinner. He should be here.
Yeah, he just texted us saying he just got back, but we'll wrap this in a few minutes because I know it's late for you. One thing I will say, I mean, the Charles Murray thing is so fascinating because so Sam Harris had him on, and then Ezra Klein took Sam Harris to task. They had this podcast that Sam Harris and Ezra Klein are both brilliant. They've both been on Turpentine shows upstream. People should listen, but they also were a little petulant with each other. They got in sort of this big drama. And the Charles Murray basically, he mentioned that sort of the controversial part. That's like one part, a small part of one book, and he wrote dozens of books, all on different. He's like a social scientist, on all different types of topics, but really, got well known in a bad way for that specific book. Well late into his career. And he's kind of decided to almost double down on like speaking or writing what he thinks is true, even if it's controversial, because he doesn't have much to lose. So he wrote a book a few years ago, maybe like 20 years after the bell curve, which kind of makes the argument that, hey, because we're not honest about these differences, we are getting ourselves into trouble because we notice disparities in outcomes between groups, and we assign it all to prejudice. And you can try to get rid of the prejudice, but you'll never get rid of the disparities, basically. And so if we were having more honest conversations, we would put less pressure on government to socially engineer these outcomes that are the equality of outcomes that are never going to happen, and having all of these sorts of crazy side effects. Now, Thomas Sowell is an intellectual who doesn't use genetics a ton. He refers to culture, and he says that the disparity in groups can be explained by culture. And one thing he kind of stresses is that you should expect disparities in groups. Like there's no reason why Russian people or French people or Italian people should have the same outcome. Like it's crazy to imagine. Like the default is groups have different outcomes, and so then it's worth studying. Why do groups have different outcomes? And you could imagine a world, as our friend likes to say, on Earth 2, where people look at the groups that are succeeding, and if we just like study them instead of like make them embarrassed about it or guilty about it, or like what we can do about human achievement. And so the question as to why groups have different outcomes or people have different outcomes is actually pretty important if you want to study human achievement, or if you want to take what works for certain people and bring it to everybody else, as opposed to just assume that it's all environmental, or all a factor of prejudice. And if we got rid of a certain prejudice, then everyone would be rising up in the same way. So that's why Murray or other people say, actually, these conversations that can't be had, maybe they're pretty important. Now, Coleman Hughes says, hey, if it's, he did Charles Murray in his podcast, and he said, hey, if it is really mostly genetic argument, why even say that? Because that's out of people's control. And so that's why I like that Thomas Sowell, or it's out of people's control for now. Now, maybe that'll change in a few years, but I like that Thomas Sowell makes it a lot about culture, because culture seems more changeable. It's definitely partly culture, and culture seems like something that people can change.
I mean, obviously, this is such a complex topic. Like, we should probably do another episode on it. But
yeah,
like, here's a couple of like counters though that I think that like it is. People don't like things that would make them uncomfortable, right? Like, and do I know whether this exists or like how much? No, like I am not like. I think so. So it's worth reading if you just type Charles Murray, Ezra Klein, Sam Harris. There's a Vox article, and it's like Ezra wrote this long.
Ezra Skated.
Essentially, it's like I think it's a useful. It's like a summary of the argument. It's obviously from a left leaning perspective. And I think like you should just be able to read it and make your own opinion on like, okay, like what do I think here? There are a bunch of links. You can kind of like get up to speed. I think this is an amazing litmus test for your ability to like hold multiple thoughts in your head and like independent thinking. Like if I had to give like an independent thinking, it'd be like, read this scenario, click through as many of the links, and I want you to come back and give me a nuanced point of view. And if you have like New York Times brain, like you just can't, you just like can't deal with it. And obviously, if you're like an actual racist, like you're probably not also going to deal with it well. But like, here's a couple of things. Like, so the culture argument that Thomas Sowell makes, and I'm as big of a Thomas Sowell fan as anyone, right? So does the culture argument hold if I want to be in the NBA? Is culture the reason I'm going to be able to get there? Maybe I can kind of be like short and not that athletic, and like I can just really train. I mean, that's actually JJ Redick credit. Like he's tall and he's athletic, but like I'm going to be a 3-point specialist, or who's that guy on Duncan whatever on the Heat, or like you just
Duncan Robinson,
right? So it's just like I'm going to be that guy, right? Yeah. But like culture doesn't like just like you can't like will yourself to be LeBron. I'm sorry. Like at a certain point,
I tried. It didn't work.
Yeah, not only did you try to be an NBA player, you tried to be a rapper. Neither.
Yeah, I was really going against my. Yeah, I was all about culture.
my point is that like okay, so we have examples of things where the heritability of certain traits, like I don't think anyone is arguing with that, and like clearly is a factor in that specific problem. Okay, so just hold that independent. So if we start to acknowledge that, then it's just like, okay, well that's a case, but no, nothing else. And then like you give another example, and then it's so then you run into this thing where it's like, okay, so now we have a whole bunch of instances where things are heritable, but the other ones are not, right? And so I think it's just like people just don't want to talk about uncomfortable things, and there's not a ton of incentive, right? To your point, it's like Charles Murray's been canceled the rest of his academic career. But I think like what's interesting is David Reich is a great example of someone who he is playing within the bounds of the game. He has not been canceled. I mean, he's as, PMC cathedral as it gets, but he is pushing the boundaries to say, hey, these are things that we society should confront, because doing the head in the sand ostrich stuff is probably not productive, right? And I think I would say like the last thing I would say is like, okay, so prejudice, and when like people get upset about like, oh well, the prejudice or this or that, it's like, are we memory holding like Jewish people haven't had any prejudice in their entire history? Yet, like if you look at the percentage of Nobel Prize winners, like what percentage of them are Ashkenazi Jewish people who, by the way, they murdered like a large percentage of them, and so like what like how are you even intellectually consistent if we're just anytime you try to go any bit one way and then you just like immediately take out the like prejudice or discrimination words? It's like no, like there are other groups of people who've had that and they seem to still also thrive. And so that's not meant to be like any coded of like, oh, this or that. It's more about like, to the David Reich point, it's like we should have those hard conversations. Otherwise, we're going to get hit with a freight train at some point when the technology exists, and then it's just going to be panic. So what I would say as a kind of like closing note is like, you should just go read that Ezra Klein piece, because it's the jumping off point for this whole argument. And you can kind of see, I would recommend the David Reich book. I'd recommend reading some of the stuff. He tends to put stuff in the New York Times when they've had new stuff. It's actually just interesting. It has nothing to do with the intelligence thing. It's much more actually about like, where did people come from? There's like this whole controversial chapter on India that basically, like, I think the book was like banned in India because obviously talks about migrations of people within India, but like you should just, and he worked with a team of people from India to try to like not be canceled about it. But like it is an interesting topic that is only going to become more prevalent as we understand more on the genetic side of things. And I like predict that this will be a major culture war issue.
Totally.
Within 10 years.
Yeah, I think it's a broader question, maybe for another time, of like, what are some truths that we're gonna have to face, and we should face them sooner, and what are other ones that actually they're just too disruptive, and it's better to just have a myth around it.
To that point, we should just like point out the French have decided as a society that paternity tests, even though they exist, we are not going to do them. It is too disruptive to our society. But no one is saying that the paternity test science doesn't exist. It is saying that like we collectively have decided that this would be too disruptive to our way of life. That to me is like that is like confronting the reality of something and then saying this is how we want our society to be.
Yeah, I'd be so paranoid. I like what, because they don't want people to realize that people aren't raising their kids, basically. Yeah.
Right. But like we could as a society be like, yeah, it sounds like intelligence, just like every other part of your DNA or your being, has some genetic component to it. We don't actually know quite how much. We're going to try to learn more because maybe there are ways we can improve it for everybody. Like we can make a magic pill that makes everyone smarter. And to use Mark's point is like AIs will make us smarter. It's like great. Everyone should have a super intelligence. If you don't necessarily genetically, get it augmented, right?
Yeah, full circle. We should own it, as we were saying. Maybe let's wrap on that. Balaji just said he wants to join, but we're an hour and a half in, so maybe we'll let him in next time.
Yeah, well, tease it for the fans.
Yeah, exactly.
Harass Antonio on the comments. Like, just make sure you're telling him that he should be on the show.
Well, not only the comment, DM him. DM him and say that.
Send memes. Like this is what we're helping from the fans.
Yeah, exactly. That's great. All right, let's wrap on that.